Hello, and welcome to this week's Movie Math. With 2023 wrapped up, we're in for a banger of a movie math today, because we're not just going over the New Year's weekend box office, but we're going to take a look at all of 2023. Ooh, and it's very interesting. Now, technically, the yearly domestic box office gold, silver, and bronze go to Universal, Disney, and Warner Brothers. That just goes to show you how big Disney is, that even when they have probably the worst year of the studio ever, they're still number two. But I would argue that from like a PR perspective, the big winners of 2023 were Universal and Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers also, I guess maybe they had so much bad PR as well. Maybe it's a bit of a wash for them. But they ended on a high note, as we're going to discuss. They also had the biggest movie of the year. But Disney, as I said, obviously had an extremely difficult year. And 2024 is already off to a horrific start for the mouse, literally, as 3 horror projects were announced New Year's Day, as Steamboat Willie officially entered public domain, that version of Mickey Mouse. And I'd be like, you were working on these before they were in the public domain. I guess that's just a small, I would think that would disqualify those projects, but apparently it does not. And while Disney is known to have a mighty legal department, I suspect they'll wait and see if everyone tires themselves out after a week of dirty Steamboat Willie memes. I mean, how long can it be fun? Also, I don't think these projects will probably do very well, because remember that Winnie the Pooh? You know, when that character entered the public domain, they made a horror movie about that, and that ended up being a big nothing. Although they are making a sequel, because I'm sure it's extremely cheap to make, and they're like, this has to work. But here's the thing: I'm really surprised that once these properties enter the public domain, we know that people don't like it when you defy expectations, right? Hollywood had a whole problem with that. So why not give people what they want when it comes to Winnie the Pooh and Mickey Mouse? Only, you could argue these new content creators who now have access to the character could say, well, hey, we do a better job giving you what you want. Why try to shock everybody instead of, as I said, giving them what they want. So we'll see how people's approach to this evolves. Maybe if it's closer to what Disney does today, then it becomes very difficult from a legal perspective, and maybe that's another reason to go the horror route. It's very interesting. This is not very cut and dry in terms of, now you can use Mickey Mouse. Because, of course, it's still very much in use by the Walt Disney Company in many, many different ways. So I think Disney's going to keep an eye on it and see how this progresses before they decide if they need to open up a new battlefront in their legal situation. But speaking of, can you do it better than Hollywood? Mickey Mouse is just like the earliest Hollywood product that's, entering the public domain, because the character has been around pretty much since like the very beginning. That's how cool Mickey Mouse is. But this is just the beginning of what you could maybe qualify as modern entertainment beginning to enter the public domain. The rule is 95 years, which at the time that the rule was created seemed like a really long time. But yet here we are, as multiple companies are celebrating 100th anniversaries. But this is going to get really, really interesting very quickly, especially because Hollywood and now streaming services are so big on nostalgia and immortal content. They want to use these characters forever. So you think about things like Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland in the public domain, and you're like, whatever. But what happens when Marvel and DC characters enter the public domain? And we're not talking the distant future here. Superman enters public domain in 2034. And I'm sure Warner Brothers was hoping that Disney was going to fight the Mickey Mouse situation just so they wouldn't have to in terms of fixing this, legally. Disney had stepped in and extended copyright law, but they decided not. I think maybe they might have felt the political space wouldn't support them this time around, and I think they would be correct. And that's another casualty of, the studios, particularly Disney, deciding to become more political, that they don't have the friends they once did to say, slap another 50 years on that copyright law. But yeah, Superman in 2034, so just 10 years from now, anyone can tell a Superman story. I mean, I guess that Warner Brothers and DC could argue only like the first version of Superman, but I mean, he hasn't changed that much. And I mean, so if you don't like the job that Warner Brothers and DC are doing, well, then in 10 years, you're up at bat. And speaking of Batman is up in 2035 and Wonder Woman in 2037. That's crazy. Big yikes. But Warner Brothers doesn't need DC to make big box office waves. Woo! Which they proved in 2023. While their DC movies did implode, although that was in large part a self-inflicted wound, Barbie opened up a whole new IP for the studio. I hope they don't mess it up. With over 600 million domestic. That's incredible. They brought Wonka back to life, and their horror division continues to be rock solid. Warner Brothers, is very, very strong in horror. Aside from bringing Barbie and Ken to life, Warner Brothers made a name for themselves in 2023. That was like their big thing in 2023. But they also, at the last minute, made a name for themselves by saving Christmas, which we discussed last weekend, with 3 releases. But now that we're 2 weekends into those movies, we can finally call the big winner of the trio, and it's definitely Wonka. I'm so happy. I love Wonka. Aquaman 2 was the only big recent release to drop post-Christmas. All the other movies surged as people had more free time after the holidays to head to the multiplex. Aquaman 2 can at least say it's a scooch ahead of the Marvels, particularly thanks to overseas. But both of these sequels imploding after their first entries each made $1 billion. I think that shows that superhero fatigue and lack of quality are real and probably related. As for The Color Purple, this is disappointing, but it has fallen off significantly since its debut, its first day. And everyone was, it opened on par with Les Mis, but it's now fallen drastically behind. As 8 days out, it's now only at a little more than half where Les Mis was at the same point. It seems most people were not interested in a remake of The Color Purple, the classic Steven Spielberg film, and the film is not getting any crossover appeal with other audiences. Another negativity of politicizing the space. It's really rough. Back to Wonka, though. Thanks to its strong overseas appeal, it has surpassed Mary Poppins Returns. Those were a little bit of a comp there for a while, and I was nervous because Mary Poppins Returns, she didn't return again. But it looks like I think Wonka will because, again, it's in only about 3 weeks, 4 weeks overseas, it's already past Mary Poppins. And I think it's going to play all through January. Oh, exciting! So I was talking to some friends of mine, and they were like, Paddington is better. And I was like, no, Wonka is better. And I'm curious. I mean, I love Paddington, but I think Wonka is really special. But my friends thought that Paddington was more special. So I'm curious which of the 2 Paul King movies you feel is better. The context of the discussion was Wonka. My friends were like, Wonka is good, but it's no Paddington. And I was like, I disagree. Paddington is charming, but in my opinion, it's no Wonka. All right, so the key to a good holiday release is that everyone in the family can see it together, from kids to grandparents. And Wonka not only met that criteria, but I've been seeing a lot of viewer comments about how the film, I know that sometimes the studios like to shut down viewer comments, and they can get pretty toxic, but there's some gold in those comments, and you should sift through them, or at least pay someone to do a report so you can just glance at it and get the takeaways. Because a lot of viewers commented about how the film is not political, nor does it have an agenda. So it could appeal to everyone, and it didn't annoy anybody. It not only was in terms of appropriateness for everybody, but it didn't upset anyone either. But I would like to point out that Wonka is still a very diverse film, and it does have several important messages. But again, none of them are political or overly aggressive. Now, this is the type of movie that Disney has historically provided, and that's something for the suits at Disney to consider as they greenlight future projects. Wonka should have been, it's not their IP, it couldn't have been from them, but that's the type of movie that they have been counted on to deliver for many, 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 many years. That's, in fact, what built the company. In fact, not just Warner Brothers Discovery, but multiple studios are filling the moviegoer needs that Disney once monopolized, but has now decided to abandon. So you have Warner Brothers Discovery with the holiday family film, and then here comes Universal with the animated movie. That's right, Migration didn't take off right away, but it is definitely finding an audience after Christmas, up 37% in its second weekend. That's incredible. I saw it on New Year's Day. I thought it was a delight. It was really fun. You don't have to see it in theaters, but if you want to go to the multiplex, I do agree that Wonka and Migration are probably, the best crowd pleasers. Although I loved The Color Purple. Now, while these numbers are very low for Illumination overall, in 2 weeks, Migration is almost caught up to Disney's Wish domestic, and that movie's been out for 6 weeks. So, Universal can at least be very proud of that. And, that should be that's very serious for Disney. We're not even at Disney yet. Okay, so and Universal had an incredible 2023, going for quality and quantity, releasing 14 new movies, which they can do because of their bold release strategy developed during the pandemic. And they ain't afraid to rush a movie that isn't working in the theatrical space to digital, sometimes as fast as 17 days. But obviously, they still need some theatrical home runs, and they got them with Super Mario Brothers and Oppenheimer. The latter, which benefited greatly from the Barbenheimer craze, yet Christopher Nolan still refuses to acknowledge Barbie at all, even though it's also a strong awards frontrunner. It's so petty. Both movies helped each other out, for sure, although it was Warner Brothers' idea to open the same weekend, thus creating Barbenheimer, right? So interesting. And while Nintendo and Illumination ended up being fantastic partners, Nintendo is going to switch dance partners for The Legend of Zelda over to Sony with Avi Arad. That's crazy that Nintendo doesn't. I think they must have had a Legend of Zelda deal already in place with Sony because, you'd think they would make a home maybe Nintendo feels it's good to have multiple partners so none of them get too comfortable, but don't cut off your nose to spite your face. Look. They're going to do live action as well instead of animation. And from what I could see from Super Mario Brothers, it's clear that movie succeeded because it felt just like the games. So how is a live action Zelda going to accomplish the same feat? Avi Arad produced fellow video game adaptation Uncharted, also live action for Sony. And while people kind of liked that movie, it wasn't any Super Mario Brothers. This is very scary to me, especially because we had identified Zelda as the next surefire hit. But Hollywood found a way to make it not surefire. All right, now over to Disney. The Mouse released just 8 movies in 2023, with only Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 performing how a Disney movie should. And James Gunn, of course, is now over at Warner Brothers DC. Their live-action adaptation underperformed. These used to be, guaranteed home runs for the studio. So did their theme park movie. Even Jungle Cruise did better. Right in the middle of the pandemic. That released day and date on Disney+. Well, you had to pay for it extra. But still, that movie performed better than Haunted Mansion. Both animation houses underperformed, and so did their 2 other Marvel movies. The Marvels, the lowest box office performer ever for the brand. And speaking of brands, Kathleen Kennedy killed another one with the new Indiana Jones movie. Disney's 2024 resolution should be to be less political on all fronts and to get some control over their creatives and executives. Looking back at Disney's 2023 slate, it becomes clear that Disney writers, directors, and creative execs made movies they felt people should see rather than movies people wanted to see. I don't think any of these movies are awful, by the way. Indiana Jones kind of comes close. But they have their priorities mixed up. And therefore are only moderately entertaining because their primary goal wasn't to be entertaining. Bob Iger has touched on this, but it's one thing to identify it and another to actually fix it. Because he's going to have, it's going to be tough. He's on his way out, but is that what he wants, his legacy? His legacy's messed up anyway. So it should at least be like, he kicked that thing into shape. So first you come up with a great story, and then you layer in the messages, not the other way around. I think Disney is tired of being on the front lines of the culture wars, and so are their fans. The front lines of the culture wars are not a fun place to be, and Disney, more than any other studio, is in the fun business. Of course, we want to see important movies that have really important messages and break down barriers, and that's a vital part of Hollywood, which I've discussed many, many times. But that's never been Disney. So that's very interesting. I think it's also talking about social media, and I think that, is what people say on social media truly what actual audiences want? We've been having this argument for years, with many of you saying that social media is not real life. And I would argue that particularly as it gets warped by new ownership, let's say, it does become less and less, I think there was a point where it did represent public opinion, but I think we're moving away from that rapidly, which is another lesson to take from 2023. DC's like, we know nobody ever showed up to any of our movies. All right, as for the other studios, Sony released 18 movies in 2023, but had little to show for it outside of Across the Spider-Verse, once again proving that the Spider-Man IP holds up that entire studio and why they ain't never going to let it go. But Killers of the Flower Moon and Napoleon's failure to follow in Oppenheimer's big drama footsteps caused a real problem for Apple's distributor partners, Paramount and Sony. And while Christopher Nolan has done interviews saying that Oppenheimer's box office performance shows that the movie business is just fine, I think what it really shows is what a powerful brand he's built himself up into. And while being called a brand might make Christopher Nolan throw up a little bit in his mouth, it doesn't matter, it's still true. More filmmakers should consider turning themselves into brands. Steven Spielberg used to be the big brand, and it seems that Christopher Nolan has now taken that spot. But what I mean by brand is that Christopher Nolan is consistent, just like a movie star is. You always know what you're going to get. And you also know there's always going to be at least some level of threshold of quality. Even though I might have had taken issue with some of the creative aspects of Oppenheimer, it's still a very well-made film and, worth going to the theater to see. So, yeah, I think Nolan's definitely a brand, and I think more creatives should consider doing that instead of, some of them are like, what do I feel like doing today? I'm going to mix it up. And it's like, well, you can mix it up, but you do so, you undercut your brand, and that's going to keep you from being able. And also, I think Christopher Nolan made something like $200 million off of Oppenheimer because of his gross participation, in gross, not net. So Christopher Nolan's doing great. I think there's nothing wrong with taking a look at his playbook. Another nice feather in Nolan's cap, by the way, is that he has the only original non-franchise. If you don't consider him a franchise, if you go by Nolan as a franchise brand rules, then he does fit the rest of these movies, which maybe is why he's there. But in the 2023 domestic top 10. That and Sound of Freedom, which was another bit of evidence of how much politics have worked their way into Hollywood, with a large group of moviegoers looking to support movies, any movie, not from Tinseltown, which also, by the way, benefited Godzilla Minus One because it came, obviously, from Toho in Japan. It's also worth noting that in the domestic list, 2 and 3 are animated movies. More evidence as well that animation is catching on with adult audiences in the West. I say due to streaming, but some of you have also pointed out due to the popularity of anime, which also is available largely through streaming. But still, it's real. I mean, I'm excited to see what Avatar, not Jim Cameron's Avatar, but, the Avatar The Last Airbender brand, although Netflix is taking it to live action, but yet the original creators are doubling, tripling down in animation with theatrical releases and new series for Paramount, or whatever Paramount ends up being in 2024. But that could be huge. Also, Warner Brothers is planning a Lord of the Rings animated movie for theaters. This is getting really interesting. And that's going to make it even harder for, I think, the more family-friendly animated movies to compete in that arena. I mean, maybe there's room for all of them, but let's hope we don't oversaturate animation like we did superhero movies. Hollywood, they never saw a good idea they didn't want to run into the ground. And while it's great to see John Wick 4 in here, if the box office was operating at the levels that it's supposed to be, 187 wouldn't qualify it. Before the pandemic, you needed over 200 million domestic to qualify. And even then, sometimes that didn't cut it. But while Taylor Swift is also under 200 million, for a concert movie that only played in theaters Thursdays through Sundays, this is incredible and a huge lifesaver for theaters in the fall this year. But not Hollywood, just the theaters, because Swift cut them out by going directly to AMC herself. Studios are used to being seen as kingmakers, not middlemen. Although they're the ones who push streaming so hard, and that has really complicated the landscape. Worldwide for 2023, some movies were able to break into this top 10 thanks to really overperforming overseas, doing much better overseas than they did in the domestic market. Fast X, 79% of its box office from overseas. Mission Impossible, 70%. And even Elemental, 69% of its box office from overseas. And they kicked John Wick 4, Sound of Freedom, and Taylor Swift off of the top 10, domestic versus worldwide. As for the rest of the New Year's weekend top 10, Anyone But You saw not just a huge surge, but the biggest in the top 10 this weekend, actually, which proves that the rom-com could really blow up on digital and streaming down the line because the appeal does seem to be there. The Boys in the Boat also continues to be very solid. That's actually incredible for that movie, which had hardly any advertising and has no big-name talent. Sorry, Joel Edgerton. But, George Clooney is the biggest name attached to that. He's only behind the camera. So to come in with 8, that's pretty strong, especially compared to poor Zac Efron and Adam Driver, who really need to rethink the projects that they're choosing. Or maybe it's them. Neither one seems to be able to sell tickets. Why aren't you seeing the Iron Claw or Ferrari in theaters? I think the Iron Claw is excellent. But Ferrari? I mean, I didn't like that movie, but at least Adam Driver is good in the film. But he can't keep being the best thing in awful movies. Maybe Iron Claw will find an audience on digital and streaming. Who knows? Maybe Ferrari will as well. I don't think so. But, maybe there's hope for Iron Claw there. But really, Iron Claw should be doing better than it is. Although, Ferrari, I'm not surprised about Ferrari, but it's really bad for Adam Driver. The Hunger Games continues to sell tickets, but interestingly, Wonka has already passed it worldwide. Because of the holiday weekend, Nielsen still hasn't updated its charts. Slow and lazy. So we'll head right to Netflix, where Rebel Moon is #1 for the second week in a row, up about 10 million from last week, where it was just the weekend on the chart, whereas here it was playing for the full week. But Leave the World Behind, for instance, runner-up this weekend, was viewed about 87 million times in its first 2 weeks on Netflix's charts, which is a weekend and a full week, whereas Rebel Moon for that same time period only had 58 million. It's crazy that Leave the World Behind would outperform Rebel Moon. I watched Leave the World Behind in the last few days, and I thought it was quite good. The ending was crazy, but I liked it, actually. Somebody said it depends how you feel about the sitcom Friends, and I like Friends, so maybe that's why I like the ending. But it's kind of like the movie M. Night Shyamalan used to make before he not only drank his own Kool-Aid, he was high on his own supply as soon as he hit the marketplace. But he's basically become a parody of himself. But this was like a good M. Night Shyamalan movie. Leave the World Behind, by the way, as we've discussed before, is produced by the Obamas, and it's really their first big hit in Hollywood. It's very impressive that they produced a film that is, genuinely a huge hit. And by the way, did not capitalize on the Obamas' involvement. They just made a good movie. So kudos to them. That's how you do it, Harry and Meghan. But hey, considering Rebel Moon is really only for Zack Snyder's core fan base, that's a pretty big core fan base. So if Zack Snyder just works on having a little more crossover appeal, he could really be cooking with gas. I think that's crucial. He's something he should consider going forward. With shows, the numbers here are awful, but there's still some interesting takeaways. Ricky Gervais, Dave Chappelle, and Trevor Noah all dropped stand-up specials and all managed to make the top 10, although Ricky Gervais blew the other ones out of the water. 4 times the audience of Dave Chappelle, which goes to show where the line is when it comes to controversial comedy. And Dave Chappelle crossed that line. I have to say, I didn't watch Dave Chappelle. I watched Ricky Gervais. I thought Ricky Gervais I thought it was a little bit too much, Ricky Gervais. I thought he crossed a lot of lines. And Trevor Noah, I thought was excellent, but very political. I think that stand-up comedy is starting to head maybe into a little bit too much into the political, being more of a lecture than entertainment. Just as some types of movies have. So I think that's maybe a note that stand-up comedy could take. But I still like the Trevor Noah. I've only watched the first half of it. I was too tired. I couldn't finish it. But I'm going to go back and watch the rest of it. Ricky Gervais, though, I found a lot of his jokes extremely offensive. But back to Dave Chappelle. His number is so low, and he isn't #1 on this list, shows huge erosion to his audience. That's not, forget a wake-up call. That might show that it's already too late. And the numbers on the show chart are so low that for the second week in a row, we couldn't do last week. We're skipping right to now. I covered Rebel Moon's first week on a live stream last week. But a fireplace is not only in the top 10, but is like moderately high up. Although Birchwood is where it's at when it comes to the Netflix fireplaces. That's my go-to. I've enjoyed it this holiday season. Then on iTunes, 3-hour movies continue to thrive on digital when you can watch them at home and add as many breaks as you want. With 4 in the top 10, 5 if you count Taylor Swift's concert. That's right, Hunger Games and Mission Impossible are both close to 3 hours. They both come in at around 2:45. As we enter awards season, the Golden Globe, so they're almost like little miniseries, right? Which is what Scorsese was saying. He was like, you sit down and you watch miniseries. Why can't you go and sit and watch my movie? But people don't watch miniseries in theaters, Marty. They watch them at home. So that's where they're watching your movie. All right, as we enter awards season, the Golden Globes are this coming Sunday, because it's not Sunday because of the holidays, but this Sunday are the Golden Globes. Are you planning to watch? I'll cover them because, they're the first big awards show. I'll tweet about them and then do a review the next day. But some awards contenders are starting to get attention, although it's also because some of these movies are on sale for just $10, including Mission Impossible, by the way, and that always helps. As for this coming weekend, Night Swim is the first big movie of 2024 as Jason Blum and James Wan in producer mode try to repeat their Megan success with Night Swim. I don't see it. Night Swim just is not the same. Megan was built for success, whereas no one's really even paying. People were very much paying attention to Megan at this point, whereas I'm sure many of you didn't even realize Night Swim was opening on Friday. But this is Universal, just like Megan was, and if it doesn't hit, then they can just push it to digital in 17 days, which I suspect they will. On digital, Anne Hathaway's Eileen just hit, a Hitchcockian-style prison thriller. While on streaming, J.A. Bayona's Society of the Snow is on Netflix this Thursday. Love J.A. Bayona. Gonna check that out for sure. Although, again, another bleak movie. While on Friday, Netflix has Dan Levy's new movie, Good Grief. Dan Levy, speaking of being popular on social media, Dan Levy was as popular or more popular than Megan. So popular. His memes are used and GIFs are used to this day. But he hasn't been able to really make anything. He hasn't been able to find what his career is like post Schitt's Creek. That's interesting. I'm surprised he can't crack it. I don't know if a really sad comedy is going to be the thing to do it, but we'll see. I love Dan Levy. I hope he figures it out. And Prime Video has Foe with Paul Mescal and Saoirse Ronan. Again, so many creatives are like, what do I want to do? And you're like, don't think about what you want to do or what you think you should do. Read the tea leaves of business and think what's going to keep your career alive. All right. I mean, again, it's always nice to be surprised, but I don't know if that's tough. I mean, you can do that too, but don't abandon the tea leaves of business. Then for new series, because it's not tea leaves, it's just cold hard facts. All right. Netflix has it might sometimes feel like looking at tea leaves, but I guess it's more like chart analysis. It's there. So anyway, back to series. Netflix, so for series this week, it's all Netflix. Netflix is Harlan Coben's Fool Me Once, which actually dropped yesterday. This is actually a very solid cast, so you might want to check this out. And Michelle Yeoh has a family crime drama starting Thursday. Michelle Yeoh is also struggling a little bit. I mean, she's certainly not lacking for work, but she can't find that big breakthrough project. All right, and that's this week's Movie Math. What have you been watching? What do you plan to watch? And what do you think about the 2023 box office? And who would you say are the winners and losers, and why? Share those thoughts down below. Subscribe today. And of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.